So earlier, I recorded a video on if you're an employee seeking out more flexibility, how to actually approach that. But one of the things as I was reflecting on some recent research on managers is that they're really struggling right now. And I know there are a lot of managers who are stuck in this really difficult place where they maybe sense that they should be, or their employees want more flexibility, but they're also stuck between leaders who maybe aren't supportive of that. It's a very difficult spot to be in. And on top of it, all the research is clearly indicating that managers are strapped. So rather than just put it on employees and put managers in yet a more difficult position, although I did give some tips for employees if you are seeking this out, how to do it to make it easier for your managers, I wanted to take some time to actually lay out some thoughts for managers specifically, because I've been in this situation many times in a number of different orgs. And I also work with a lot of managers on how can they do that. So if you're an employee, go check out the other video. But if you're a people manager and you're trying to figure out how do I navigate this flexibility thing, then this is the video for you. So with this, you know, before I even get into the how, I think it's really important to emphasize why you should care about this. I think a lot of times we don't get into the contextual piece. And if you skip over the contextual, you're already convinced, well, there's chapters in the video and you can look it up and you can skip to that part. But if you're on the fence going, I just don't know how I feel about this, or maybe I'm uncomfortable with it, or maybe it just seems like too hard of a task to take on, which I completely understand. There are a lot of pressures on you as a people manager, and the thought of going further to try and fight for flexibility for your team can feel overwhelming, but I don't think it has to be. So let me make the case for why you should care. One of the biggest one is your team members want more flexibility. The data is conclusive on this. There is no question of, if you asked an employee, would you like more flexibility in your job? Almost unanimously, the answer would be yes. Even if they're not saying it, I think sometimes it's easy to not recognize when our employees are just telling us what they think we want to hear. And maybe they sense you're stressed, or maybe they just feel uncomfortable. So when you say, do you want this? They're going, no, I'm good. It's all good here. The data is clear. There are channels and there are a multitude of different ways that I'm plugging into this. And every one of your team members would want more flexibility if it was available to them. So on top of it, because of that, it makes it a fantastic way to motivate and reward your employees and incentivize them. I think a lot of times when we think about incentivizing teams, we often go to just the traditional approaches. Well, how do we give them more money? How do we give them praise? How do we do these other things? Well, flexibility is actually a fantastic way to do it. And I think you're going to see it's a lot easier than you think. You may be saying, depending on your environment, I don't think you understand that, my situation, but I can tell you it honestly may be easier than you think. And honestly, don't underestimate, and you may experience this, asking to get more money for your employees can actually be a lot tougher than we think. So sometimes those traditional ways we go about it, well, we'll incentivize through these, can actually be really difficult. And I've been on the side of this many times where you go through all the hassle of trying to get somebody an increase to hopefully fulfill something that they're lacking, and then it doesn't work, or it does for a couple months, and then they're still not really happy because really it wasn't really about money. Money was nice, but that really wasn't it. And I think that's one of the biggest thing. Now, here's the thing. I totally understand that flexibility isn't always possible, at least by the definition of can everyone work from home. I will say I've worked from home a good chunk of my career, but I've been in the office and I've been in a number of different settings. I recognize it's not always the case, but there are ways you can do it. And that's, I think, one of the things that it's a really good way to incentivize and reward and recognize your people is they know there's things that could be more flexibility. They see it. So when you deny that, it's a little bit of a, okay, I know I can, but you're telling me I can't. So this is a way to get around that. The other thing I'm just going to say, if you look at the data, the expectation from employees, even in roles that maybe today there's little room or perceived room for flexibility, with automation and AI and some of these other things that are happening, it's only going to rise. The expectation is just going to continue to rise. So even if right now you're not feeling the heat or the pressure for flexibility from your team, it's coming for you. And like I said, there's probably a good chance it's already there, even if you're not hearing it. So if that doesn't make a case for it, I don't know what will. But what I would say is make this a priority for your team. Don't wait until you have someone who approaches you or until you're about to lose someone to actually decide, you know what, I think I'm actually going to do something with this. But so what do you do? Because I get that this can sound like an overwhelming task. One of the, quite frankly, easiest things, although it can be uncomfortable if this is not something you're terribly familiar with, is actually getting to know your team individually on a personal and professional level. I think this is something we've seen over the past couple years where historically we've kept nice compartments between our professional and personal lives, and COVID and hybrid work and all these other things have kind of exploded all of that. And where you used to be able to get away with it and not necessarily know much about a person's personal life, you kind of have to now, which is a good thing. I think it helps you get to know them holistically. But by doing this, you're going to find out what's important to them. And that's a really important part of not only giving them more flexibility, but just being a better manager, doing a better job of leading your team, understanding how to work with these folks. So this isn't just a benefit to you if you're trying to give them more flexibility. You're going to find it has a lot of ancillary benefits. But one of the big ones is it's going to help you know where that flexibility matters, because the reality is a majority of people want more flexibility for personal reasons. They're not asking for this or not desiring this for professional reasons. It has nothing to do most of the time with anything professional. This has to do with things going on in their personal life, conflicts they may have, priorities that may be competing, things like that. That's what's driving this. And if you don't take the time to get to know your team members on a personal level, that doesn't mean you need to be their therapist, but you should get to know their family situation, what's important to them, what do they do outside of work. That's going to help you understand, oh, okay, maybe this is something that I have a better understanding of why this is really important to you. Now, I will be the first to say that this is important because trust is a huge factor when it comes to flexibility. If there isn't trust, you are going to struggle with getting flexibility right with your org. But a lot of that comes with closer relationships. And so by starting to tread into these waters of how do I get to know you as a whole person? How do I get to know each one of you on a personal and professional level? What are the things that matter to you? And again, this doesn't have to be an ushy-gushy therapy conversation. This can be simple asking questions about things. What do you like to do outside of work? What are some of the things that are really important to you? You will find out. And if you ask these things and are intentional about it, you will find that people are willing to share, but it may not come right away, and be aware of that. Some people, their boss starts asking these questions. You've got to understand, if you don't already have a high trust level, they may be met with some skepticism. But if you're honest about the fact that, listen, I know flexibility is important to people, but some of that is getting to know you and building trust and understanding your situation. So I want to take a little bit of time to get to know you a little bit deeper than that. It might still take some time. So just be aware of it. The next two are things that I often see as major problems when you start treading into the flexibility water. Once you go into this, if you want to give your teams more flexibility, make sure you take the time ahead of time. Don't wait until there's a problem to align on. Sorry, I forgot to make a note here. Make sure you align on the communication tools and processes and norms. Lack of communication is usually one of the biggest breakdowns when it comes to flexibility. You have expectations that they're not aware of. Something changed and they're not letting you know, or you're not letting each other know in a way that, is working for both of you, or in a time frame. And what happens is when that happens, when there's a breakdown in communication, the trust gets eroded, and then it makes flexibility harder. Going to the previous point I made, if you don't have that deep sense of trust where this person is committed and ultimately trying to do the right thing and do their job well, when that starts to erode, then suddenly flexibility comes into place because you're starting to question things. They're starting to feel that pressure, right? The whole thing just snowballs out of control. And a big way you get around this is by talking about how are we going to communicate? What are the things? And you need to talk openly about this. And it's not just about you. As a manager, let me just put that on the table. This is not just about you going to them going, I'm willing to give you flexibility, and in return, you must this. And this is how you must do it. This needs to be an open, two-way conversation about what you need. Don't make it about the how. Talk about what's really important to you and what you need, and also find out what they need. There may be some things. And the thing you need to recognize as a manager is a lot of times flexibility brings this guilt along with it. People who have flexible working situations a lot of times wrestle with guilt because they feel like, why am I getting this and others aren't? Are people thinking poorly of me because I have this opportunity and they don't? And so on top of it, there's already going to be a heightened level of awareness of any of those things. And so by talking about, hey, let's just be really open and clear on what these things are, and let's do our best to get in front of it before it becomes a problem. Let's talk about how we need to communicate. Again, I'm thinking if you're in a remote work situation, what do you want to do in terms of the chat tools? Do you have some, ways that you want to do it? Do you like text messaging versus picking up the phone? Do you need lead time on certain things just based on the situation? Talk a lot of those things through, as many as you can, so that when it happens, you're not wrestling through it and now trying to walk backwards from unmet expectations or perceptions that you've now formed. Get in front of it. Now, the other thing with that is when something isn't working, when something bubbles up, be sure you're open about it. If something breaks down, if someone feels a certain way, if you feel like as a leader, I offered this flexibility, this happened, I didn't really hear from you, have that conversation and find out why. And it may just be a breakdown in communication or a misunderstanding of expectations. And the sooner you can do that, the better. And again, these conversations are going to benefit you in other areas than just flexibility. Trust me. But then on top of it, this is also a great way to start building trust and continuing to build trust. You have these conversations ahead of time instead of waiting till something happens and now you're arguing over it, or you're feeling a certain way, or they're feeling a certain way. You just get in front of it. You're building the trust. You're talking things through. You're preparing and setting a strong foundation for what flexibility looks like. Now, the other one that I'm going to add on here is this is a shift. If you're a people manager, one of the most difficult shifts I see for people managers is making the transition from focusing on activity to outcomes. And this happens a lot. This would probably be the number one place where I see a breakdown in flexibility and discrepancies between managers and their direct reports. There is a lack of clarity on what really is the desired outcome. What is it you're hoping to accomplish? And be more comfortable with saying, I don't necessarily know, how that looks. I don't know what you need to do to get there, but I do know this is what is expected of you. I expect this from you. And I'm going to start to open the doors to let you do that a little bit. This could go two ways. This may mean as a manager, you may need to get to know the work a little better. I think sometimes part of the reason why managers don't focus on outcomes is they aren't really sure what the work is. They're not really sure what's they expect of their people. So when that happens, you start to pull back into this. Well, as long as I see you doing something that makes me feel better about it, so I'm going to assume that it's the right things, when quite frankly, it may not. And this is where you run into performance problems that people feel like, well, I didn't even know what was expected of me, and you're telling me I'm not delivering on things. So starting to get to know the work a little better may help you. Although the caution I would add to that is be careful that you don't focus on getting too familiar with the work, because that may actually work against you in this. If you know the work inside and out, there is going to be such a higher likelihood. If you get too close, there's going to be a higher likelihood that you're going to start looking at things going, no, that's how I would do it. No, I would expect to do it this way. And so when it's not going how you think, that tendency to kind of lean in and go, well, you know what, here, just give it to me. Let me tell you how to do it. Let me give you explicit instructions, which is the arsenic of flexibility. You will not have a successful, flexible environment if you are micromanaging, which again, you get around this, you're going to see benefits outside of just getting a flexible work thing working. But I think it's really important to start to make that shift of what do I really expect from my employees? What do I need to see out of them? And be careful because often the activity masks itself as an outcome. Well, the outcome from them is I'd like to see them doing this work this many hours a day. That's not an outcome. That's an activity. I'd want to see them working on this way. Well, that's a how. What are you hoping? What are you desiring to see as a result of that? Start practicing getting crystal clear on that, and you'll quickly find, you know what? I'm actually seeing more opportunities for flexibility because now as I think about that being the outcome, there actually might be more flexibility in how we actually get there than I realize. And I even see this sometimes in hourly employees where it can feel like, I just don't think there's any way we can do this. Well, you'd be surprised. There are certainly a lot of things where when you start focusing on the outcomes, yes, you still have the limitation of hours and clocking and things like that, but the actual how and what that looks like can be completely different. And another thing I would just add to this is make sure you're inviting your team into this dialogue. I have seen many managers burn themselves out trying to figure out how to provide more flexibility to their team, trying to figure out how to navigate all this stuff. And they're doing it in a silo. They're trying to figure it out for the best reasons. They may not want to burden their team. Maybe it's not the best reasons. Maybe you think you have all the answers. Either way, don't do it. Invite your team into that. Ask, hey, if these are the outcomes, what do you see as different ways we might be able to do it differently? This again goes back to trust. You're being more proactive and saying, I've thought through a little more what I really need out of you. How could we be more flexible in the way we deliver that? How can we measure that those outcomes are happening if we're not doing it the way we used to do? That kind of dialogue will start to unlock doors and open possibilities for where flexibility can creep into your organization, where you maybe previously thought this is just impossible. There's just no way this work can be done flexibly versus, you know what, now that we talked about what we need to achieve and I've invited the team into that conversation, wow, they came up with a whole lot of ideas about what we might be able to do differently or how we might be able to execute against things, still accomplish the same goal, but do it in a wildly different way than I ever imagined. The last and final thing that I will add to this mix is just experiment with it. I think sometimes people overwhelm themselves. Over the years, I've seen people overwhelm themselves a lot, trying to figure out every possibility of every single situation of how do we make this work for every single person exactly the same way, instead of saying, where do we really have a need? Where do we really see some low-hanging fruit that we think could work, where work might be able to be more flexible? And then let's experiment with it. We don't need to go all in with it. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. I think that's a really important thing. And having realistic expectations about those experimentations. There are going to be things that you try that will not work. Someone may have what sounds like a great idea. You may think you're crystal clear on the outcome, and you may pursue it, and it may go down like the Hindenburg. And that's okay. If there's one thing that I try and encourage more and more managers on, is that you're not going to hit the ball every single time. You're going to miss probably more than you hit, and that's okay. So being realistic about the expectations of, listen, we're trying to be more flexible, trying to provide more flexibility to you. Let's try some things on a smaller scale and see what works. And if it doesn't work, let's figure out why it didn't work and see, are there things we could do differently? Or do we decide ultimately, maybe this isn't the right way we exercise flexibility. Maybe we need to look in a different area. I would also add, when it comes to the experimentation, and maybe some of this is just my personality, I would encourage people to ask for forgiveness, not permission. Now, I say that carefully because obviously there are ways that you can do this recklessly and you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. But for the most part, if you take my previous statements as intended, which is start small, experiment, see what happens, show positive results, even if you're in an environment where you may have senior leadership or others who are very opposed to flexibility, if you're trying small things, first of all, most of the senior folks don't have time to pay attention to these details. So if you're making small tweaks and changes, nobody's showing up at your door talking about this. But the other thing is, if you're making these small experiments and you're showing a real positive benefit, you're seeing lower attrition, you're seeing less turnover, you're seeing higher engagement scores, and you've made these minor tweaks, even if that's not the organizational culture you're in, you can actually start to build that by showcasing ways that you've experimented and delivered wins. And I think that's a really important thing, is sometimes we feel this obligation before we do anything. We need to go ask and make sure we've laid out the whole plan and gotten the rubber stamp of approval on things. And I will be the first to say my personality is more, well, let's just try it and see what happens. I wouldn't encourage people to just go off the deep end, suddenly tell your whole team, you know what, just work from home and I'll clock you in here. And don't do that kind of stuff. That could end up getting you fired. But there may be things where you go, you know what, if we flex your schedule on this day, or if we allow you to have this one day working from home because that's a really important day, you don't need to go ask permission to do all of these things. And you may find that, yeah, if you ask permission, you might get told a lot more, versus if you just do it small, assess the risk, make sure you're not taking too many unhealthy risks. You may find that even if the original answer would have been, no, you can't do that, by the time you get to that point, maybe more of a dialogue, and you may actually be encouraged in what the flexibility you found for your team may benefit others. So for all you managers out there, I hope you found this helpful as you continue looking at how can you provide more flexibility for your teams. Have a good one.